The Kiros Report is truly honored to bring an old colleague whom I haven't seen for the last 20 years until we recently ran into each other in the famous Harvard Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And then I took the heroic decision, considering how busy he is, to invite him to have a conversation with me in the Kiros Report. So today, the Kiros Report brings you Professor Winston Langley, who is an Emirati Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, in which he taught as a stellar professor for 30 years until he transitioned because of his sterling character and his administrative skills to serve first as a provost and then as vice chancellor of the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He's known as a prolific writer who has produced about 100 articles and even more, and several books that address themselves to some of the perennial features of the human condition: peace, human rights, the abolition of war, and many, many other fascinating matters. His vocation, he tells me, began with an inclination on the part of his parents, who cultivated him to consider the profession of becoming a medical doctor and encouraged him to take courses in biology. But fate did not take him there because he began developing interests in philosophy, political science, history, and international relations very early on, which led him to really adroitly master these fields and become a very serious voice who has something original to say to the world. So today, which is really a meeting of two minds who worked as colleagues about 20 years ago, to begin what I hope will be an ongoing professional relationship in the future. And we'll begin this episode with the professor by addressing ourselves, if time permits, which is about an hour, to two central themes. The first theme would be the idea of war, that in one of his books he wants to abolish. His latest book, I think, is appropriately designated as The Abolition of War, that I would like to discuss with him. And secondly, I also chose him to be the first critical responder to my 23rd book called Zara Yacob's Inauguration of Modernity and Cardiocentrism, in which I try to discuss the functions of the human heart. I have asked him to converse with me, since the book is bound to produce provocations among philosophers and scientists who do not seem to think very much about the human heart. And this particular person is trying to make a case for it. So we'll discuss that also. Welcome to the Kiros Report, Professor Winston Langley.
Thank you very much for having invited me and to be present in this engagement with you. The two subject areas you mentioned are very close to my heart, and I look forward to the discussion with every enthusiasm.
Excellent. Thanks again. So let the first question be the following. If, as Noam Chomsky would say, a given phenomena could be analyzed deeply only and only if the question is formulated adequately. So let me try to formulate a question for you. As you know, the famous English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, in the wake of the 17th century, in his famous work, appropriately called the Leviathan, an image of a monster embodied in a king, in which he contends that we humans are fated to live a rather nasty, short, and brutish life. And in that, what is even more, we are intrinsically selfish, almost narcissistic, and greedy. And what is even more, he contends that our nature is essentially that of desiring beings, a desire after desire after desire, which he contends ceases to be only in death. The implications of this, I think, for the idea of abolishing war are quite phenomenal. I would like to put this challenge to you. How are we going to harmonize, if Hobbes is right, that human beings are essentially not good? And in that, because they are desiring beings, they desire for resources, which they don't necessarily need. And they don't stop desiring for these resources, which leads to war. And in that, we are in a permanent condition of war then, given our nature. I sense a paradox here between thinkers like yourself who are calling for the abolition of war against the background, if Thomas Hobbes is right, that human beings are warring beings, that they cannot help but desire war.
Well, that is quite an assignment, I must say. If you will allow me to say that I think Thomas Hobbes was incorrect, and I'll try my best to prove that he was incorrect. But before one does so, one ought to pay respect to him and to say that much of contemporary life wears his theory under the name of political realism, in which human beings are in fact depicted as angry, desirous, always in fact desiring, selfish, and in fact cruel. And absent some instrument to effect at least some limited containment of their behavior, they will act antisocially toward all other human beings. If we accept that to be true, then of course the abolition of war is impossible. That's not the case, however, as a number of other theories have suggested. His successor in influence in Britain, John Locke, suggests that the selfishness that one might have deduced, as Hobbes would suggest, is in fact balanced by a strong social sense of empathy. Jean-Jacques Rousseau from France went even further and argued that human beings in what is considered the pre-civil society were rather empathic, caring, and it is civil society which has in fact induced the type of aggression and aggressiveness depicted by Hobbes. So Rousseau and others were seeking for a return to what might be considered a more natural state. And indeed, when we come to discuss Zara Yacoub, one will see that he thinks that matters that have been created by an almighty have within them the impulse for goodness. So if one were to look at the evolutionary path, and biology informs us in this manner, Darwin, in his work, The Descent of Man, indicates that human beings ought to be proud of what they have thus far achieved. This is in the midst of the 19th century that he's saying this. Well, what is this about which human beings ought to be proud? Well, they have in fact descended from unicellular organisms to becoming human beings, and in the process of doing so, have extended their sympathies beyond the cell to the organs, to the systems, to the village, to the city, to what was then the nation state. That is a remarkable achievement, he said. And it needs but one other step to extend the sympathies to humanity as a whole, beyond the nation state. So Darwin himself, the author of evolution, envisioned another step. I would also like to suggest that indeed one of the things that David Hume sought to acquaint us with in the realm of sympathy is that human beings become accustomed to a sort of umbrella of that sympathy, what he calls affectation. And we can exceed it at our own risk, or we can underextend it at our own risk. That people become accustomed to those about whom one ought to be sympathetic. Social learning allows that. And any government that behaves in a manner that does not extend the sympathetic cord to a deserved group within its borders is likely to be punished. On the other hand, if it is overextended to those deemed to be unworthy, that also is going to be punished. And in contemporary life, we find that migrants, for example, are seen as perhaps not worthy of the extension of these sympathies, and governments that extend it are very often punished. But that's because we have not grown to understand that our own identity is implicated in that of the other. And that's what the central substantive contribution of the human rights regime has been. Namely to say that a national identity is not the highest one that an individual can have. It is not that to which our primary loyalty ought to be extended, but our human identity. And to the extent we accept that human identity, then we cannot war against our neighbor or fellow human beings, etc.
Excellent. Now, what is your vision of international relations for the future in light of the turmoil, aggressiveness, and general malaise and unhappiness that seems to be environing the world at the moment? How can we reconfigure relationships among and between human beings, about which you've written extensively, so that we can envision a different world than the one that we have now? Because the one that we have now, correct me if I'm wrong, seems to be fundamentally vindicating the Hobbesian thesis,
Yes,
namely that the world is not being a good place.
a very hostile place.
Hmm.
Indeed, the book Abolishing War seeks to suggest that the world from approximately 1648 to 1945 is governed by what we call the Westphalian Order. It's an order of bloodletting, of revenge, of anger, and the wish to inflict more and more pain, with armies constructed to do exactly that. We shamefully become proud of possessing nuclear weapons that can extinguish the species itself. So that very much suggests an Hobbesian world. But something happened in 1945 when the crowned heads that had met in Dumbarton Oak a year earlier to draft the charter for the UN and sought to continue the process of the Westphalian Order, they were met in San Francisco a year later with a number of human groupings, non-governmental organizations, Society of Lawyers, of unions, women's groups, church groups, a diverse body of people from throughout the world and throughout the United States. And they indicated they would have nothing to do with the Charter unless the human rights, which had been whispered and sometimes announced to induce a sort of a marshalling of moral impulse for the war, were included in the Charter itself. The original draft had one mention of human rights, despite the Atlantic Charter Churchill and Roosevelt and others had done. And that was introduced by the former Soviet Union, having to do with economic considerations. By the time the San Francisco Charter emerged, the final charter, one had many different references to human rights, and indeed it became part of the first four ends that the Charter was to support. And the first end of the Charter was to destroy the main institution of the Westphalian system, namely, it promised succeeding generation that there would be no war at all, that they would destroy war as an institution. The second was to reaffirm faith in human rights. The third, to establish conditions by which justice based on human rights and fundamental freedom could be established. And four, to promote a social system that would allow for higher standards of material circumstances for all peoples throughout the world. And then it refines all of those in ways that could be implemented. Unfortunately, elements of the Westphalian Order are also in the Charter. For example, giving of 5 countries a veto against decisions that could be made in a manner consistent with the well-being of all human beings rather than the national interest of nation states. So we have that major problem. The second is that we have not emphasized human rights in a substantive manner. We have emphasized it in a procedural manner. So we all learned about the right to worship and for tolerance and for healthcare and for freedom of the press, etc. All procedural. And never learned that we are brothers and sisters and we wear a common identity and must indeed act accordingly. So, to recharge that spirit to which you referred, the book proposes several things, among them a recasting of the UN, a radical alteration in its structure, as we know now, and I can go into some of these if you want me. Two, an emphasis on the substantive character of human rights. Three, a push in the direction of what we're going to discuss later, the role of feelings in human affairs are not just reasoning, and a massive global movement of nonviolence. If we respect our brothers and sisters, we cannot use violence against them. Now, if you want me to go into some of the alterations in the UN Charter, I shall be happy to do so.
Please do.
Yes. The first thing I sought to do, and I'll go through the different organs, is to suggest that the Security Council, we should not expect that the 5 permanent members will suddenly give up the privilege they currently enjoy. It is really a monarchical privilege by which successive governments of nations over the years succeed to a permanent position, an inherited position, the right to exercise veto. In other words, every succeeding government of Britain, the United States, China, France, and the United Kingdom inherits the veto. It's contrary to every principle of equality and democracy. So we claim that they are unlikely to accept it. But what we can do, we can create a condition by which they will be embarrassed to exercise that veto. And here are the conditions. No additional permanent members will be added, as is being contemplated today. Instead, we will have 6 or 8-year terms for countries such as Japan and Germany and India, perhaps one for Africa as a whole, for Brazil, or perhaps given states within Africa, Ethiopia, South Africa, Nigeria, however it is deployed. They are re-electable based on their behavior in implementing the terms of the Charter, not on the basis of any hereditary principle. The General Assembly will re-elect them. We will continue the existing 2-year tenure for usually accorded to smaller states, and expand the membership of the Council to about 24, keeping the permanent members as we know them today. Linked to this is something that happened in the Korean War. Because the former Soviet Union and the United States were using their veto to prevent each other from gaining an advantage in the world at large, the Security Council was deadlocked. It could not act at all. And so it was agreed that in such cases, the General Assembly, through what is called a Uniting for Peace resolution, may take action to preserve international peace and security. Given the current differences between and amongst certain permanent members, the veto will continue to cripple the UN. So the proposal is to revive the Uniting for Peace resolution, and with additional members that are going to be serving for 6 or 8 years, their armies can instead be put at the disposal of the UN for purposes of dealing with certain matters affecting international peace and security. I'll come back to this matter. The second area of modification is that of the Secretariat. Currently, the Secretary General is chosen for 2 consecutive terms of approximately 4 years, and she or he, and we have only he, usually is elected in a manner that is inconsistent with anything we associate with democracy. The Security Council is supposed to propose the name, and the General Assembly is supposed to vote on the name. Over the years, the Security Council has chosen but one person. So the General Assembly doesn't have a choice at all. And it has usually done so with the General Assembly having very little time to deliberate. The third problem is that the Secretary General, when he has been elected, has spent more time thinking about a second term and curry favors with the permanent members of the council, and so has been less effective than he or she otherwise may be. The proposal is to have one single term of 7 or 8 years for a Secretary General, so that she or he is not looking for a second term and can focus on the interests of the people of the world at large. It is also the case that the General Assembly should be allowed the authority to reject proposed members from the Security Council and be allowed more time to deliberate, consistent with the importance of the position.
Okay.
A third proposal is to modify the International Court of Justice, the people who are recruited to it, so that we go beyond the common law system of law, the civil law system, which we have in Western Europe, to encompass Islamic, Hindu, traditional African systems, Buddhism, etc. So that while the decision may very well be the same, the reasoning may be quite different. I'll give you an illustration. Ethiopia and South Africa banded together, Ethiopia and Liberia banded together to institute a case against South Africa, for extending apartheid into Southwest Africa, early 1960s. The International Court of Justice said, well, you have no standing. You're not being injured. None of your citizens are being injured. So why do you come and expect us to rule on this matter? A Japanese judge, coming from the Buddhist tradition, it said, well, of course we have standing. All of us have standing that we live up to the promise we have made under the UN Charter. We obligate ourselves toward each other. We're also members of a common species. That was not part of the reasoning in either the common law or the civil law of Europe.
Okay. All right. Well, this is quite detailed and very, very informative. Before we move to the second and final part of our conversation, let me ask one more question, namely, as you were just hinting, and quite rightly, the human self, the original human self, inhabited a single space and time, which resulted in the creation of the world in which we live. And yet, we humans who are masters of separating ourselves from one another have now quartered the world into what we call the global south and the global north. And the interests of the members of the global south and the members of the global north are at loggerheads. The UN now is being challenged by BRICS, for example, with the baptismal interventions of the Soviet Union, China, Iran, South Africa, etc., which really contaminates the possibility of looking at this world as a singular world that could either be reformed or destroyed by members of the human species. But that's not what we have done. We have also divided the world into the north and the south.
Yes, indeed. And I'll just say this parenthetically before addressing your concern. Part of the body of reforms I suggested is to bridge that divide through a series of reforms in the international economic arena, a little more consistent with the proposals for a new international economic order. There's also a proposal dealing with a global university system through UNESCO and a new system of global healthcare. So all of those are provided for in the book to get around the issue of the North-South. But let me address that very specifically. Yes, the Article 2, Section 7 of the UN Charter suggests that the UN itself should not interfere in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of states. That is the old Westphalian system. If we are sisters and brothers, if we belong as one, there's no such thing as domestic affairs that serves as an unbridgeable wall. The concern for Qazi Nasrul Islam, which you and I will speak about, his position is that if a single human being is humiliated anywhere in the world, it is a humiliation of you and of me. And we must act accordingly. The idea of a North and South has emerged because after the political independence of the global South, part of the racism which had defined the South in terms of colonial outposts continued. And since commercial and economic affairs, not just the military, have such confining influence on the behavior of peoples and countries, they were still in a state of coloniality in language, in patterns of trade, in patterns of investment, in patterns of technology sharing, etc. So, because of a continued effort of many countries, especially in the North, to have a privileged existence, a cleavage developed, which under the human rights regime should not at all have developed. Should not at all develop in the space you referred to earlier that defined how we came to be originally. But for very reasons of domination, technological domination, and that will become even more important in the future, commercial domination, financial domination, we have a single currency in the world that dominates trade, investment, etc. Now, that currency is not one that belongs to the people of the world. It's a currency that belongs to one state in the world. And unless we are thinking of a single global state, we have to deal with the matter of a single currency also. So the global South, with immense riches, culturally, materially, and other, has to behave in a manner as a taker in international relations, largely speaking, rather than as a maker. BRICS came into being because of this, and in fact, while it could have some favorable influence in preventing a single global state from emerging, unipolarism as it's called, it also could be a source of further division of humankind.
Okay. Now,
yes.
We have about 18 minutes left, and I know you have quite a bit to say about the second part of the conversation. I wonder, in your critical and honest judgment, what could the role of the heart in contrast to the brain be in the imaginary possibilities of harmonizing the interests of the North and the South so that we can address the human condition as a global project. I wonder if you had had some time to at least skim through my book I would just released.
Yes. I think its potential contribution to a North-South meeting, and not just a meeting, but as a continuing interrogation of hearts, happens, in my judgment, to be immense. From what I found in your work is that Zara Jacob is a disruptor. A disruptor of what is normally understood as normal. And part of what has been normal in the West and now for the world at large because of the cultural dominance of the West is that reasoning and rationality, conduct that emanates from what is considered the brain, is the only one that merits respect. That's what has become normal. Here is a philosopher, a man whom, in my mind, I am now comparing with Omar Khayyam of Persia, Francis Bacon of Britain, a contemporary thinker from a distinguished professor from the Department of Neurology in the Iowa College of Medicine. He has a recent book, The Feeling of What Happens, Body and Emotion in the Making of Consciousness. Gandhi, my experiment with truth. I see him as being in the midst of this body of thinking that the West and the world has not properly wrestled with. If we understood that there is no separation between the brain and the heart, and that the brain is actually an extension of the heart, that the brain gets its light, its direction from the heart, and that this heart offers a third space, within which human beings can jointly interrogate each other with reasoning shaped by a common feeling, then we'd also understand several things. One, that stances we take may be transitional. They may not be final. The heart is a dynamic organ. It does not always suggest the finality of things, but it insists, as Jacob did, on testing things. Testing things from experience And that which defines us is not what we think or what we claim, but what we do. He accepts the world as it is created, as something good. And by definition, there is something good about us because we are part of that creation. And if there's something good about us, we perhaps have the capability of discerning between what is good for us as individuals and good for the group as a whole, and what is good for the North and the South by extension. We can also avoid what may be considered extremism. Part of philosophy over the years has been to wonder whether there is something called a golden mean to things, and whether human behavior is capable of finding that mean that prevents us from moving to extremes for ourselves personally or in our relationship to others. Colonialism was an extreme, an evil extreme. Elements of it are still with us. And we have not found a way of selecting a mid-path between North and South.
Okay.
Paradocentrism is the road.
In fact, what you've done, which is remarkable, is to tie it with the project of the abolition of war, and to even add on to your thesis. There is now a growing movement of the reinterpretation of human nature.
Yes.
Countering the Hobbesian thesis, brilliantly articulated in the Upanishads, in which the self is simply looked at impervious to separation, because we are all entangled. So the notion of entanglement, which is central to quantum mechanics, is equally central to the Upanishads, because even on the atomic level of the configuration and constitution of the human self, what is being observed by the observer, who in the course of observing something or the other is also observing itself, is that the atoms themselves are entangled, and in that one atom cannot coherently exist without its entanglement to the next atom, which is similar to the argument in the Upanishads that
Yes.
the notion of separation is simply nonsensical, because the self is a united whole, which is what Zara Yacob, in the wake of the 17th century, from the standpoint of revolutionary Christianity, is also bringing into the discourse about our inherent entanglements with one another. And in that these separations into the global south, the global north, and so forth and so on the atomic level, are nonsensicals. But human beings have been systematically conditioned for generations to take entanglements as features of the human self when they really are not. And in that the new education for the next generation, I try to modestly contend in the book, is the re-education of humankind to rediscover its hidden potential, namely entanglement, unity.
Indeed, as going through your work, I wished I had had it even as a citation for my book on abolishing war, because, as mentioned, one of the reforms suggested is the complete reformation of the UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and the creation of a new system of universities, because existing universities, in my mind, are still under the Descartesian way of thinking, among other things, along with a major nationalist strain. The enmeshment of human beings is not part of their thinking, or they will confuse enmeshment with a single point of entry, namely Harvard Square or London or Cambridge or Oxford, etc. The envisioned university would have a new curriculum with one major campus on every continent or subcontinent, and of course all of the schools and colleges we today have. But for example, in the teaching on issues of the environment, the focus would be on a management of the life-producing and sustaining system of the globe itself, and to show students how these, to use your own word, are intermeshed. They're inseparable. And part of what we're fighting for the environment, is that enmeshment, and all political, social, and economic institutions should pattern their behavior accordingly. That's Jacob's position.
In fact, to your credit,
Yeah.
I know you're characteristically modest. I looked at the heroic efforts you made, first as a provost, and then as a vice chancellor at UMass Boston. I wish I had contacted you 20 years ago, before I became old. So
You're young at heart.
So that I could work for you. You even dared to redefine the idea of the classics.
Yes.
It's exactly the correct route. That the classics need not necessarily be centered only on Europe.
Sure.
Every tradition, every cultural contribution of the members of the human species have classics in them. And in that, we need to redefine the idea of the classics, so that we could have an Indian presence, an African presence, a Chinese presence, a Latin presence, the presence of all human beings who've been attempting to define themselves. You did this. You're the only administrator that I know of who made an effort to do this. What saddened me, as I told you when I met you at Harvard Square, is that you retired too early. This work needed your presence at UMass Boston, because it's the work that is going to take a lifetime effort. I did not want.
Thank you. I must say that I had not planned on leaving, and I regret that I did not finish the work I thought I began there with you, and indeed, just what you are doing with Jakob is exactly what Professor Tamjidi is doing with Omar Khayyam. He's writing a 12-volume work on Omar Khayyam, and the thinking between these two great, in fact, I see them as world figures, is astonishing, and that we today know so little about them says something about the narrowness within which we have been living. We should not bequeath this to our children and our children's children.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, this has been a remarkable opportunity for us to meet and start a conversation which will be ongoing. I cordially invite you when you have time to come and give us a report once a year on what you're doing. And much more importantly, I also appeal to you to help me institutionally to spread this project at a suitable university with you as my mentor. From the depth of my heart, for so readily willing to come to the Kiros Report and give what many will consider a phenomenal contribution. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And believe me, I will make every effort in that direction. I think everybody should have the Kiros Report.